This video will go over part 3 of chapter 8, which deals with social issues that are tied to newspapers and print journalism. Now, newspapers are a large part of American culture, even if they are largely considered to be dying. Compared to local TV, radio, and online only outlets, newspapers still produce nearly 50% of our original news stories. Local papers generate nearly 60% of stories in one of the studies that was done in 2019 by Mahone and other journalism researchers. They found that although local newspapers are shrinking nationwide, they remain a vital provider of the original important information to U.S. communities. And so, without our local newspapers, without newspapers as a whole, these original stories are not being generated. So that brings us to a discussion of news deserts. News deserts really address the loss of local news organizations and the implications for our democracy. Now, UNC actually has a wonderful resource on news deserts that you'll be using within your discussion question that looks at the trends of news deserts. News deserts are those that either have no newspapers or only have one newspaper and therefore are in danger of not having news. And uh, in the United States, 200 counties don't have a local newspaper. Half of all counties only have one newspaper, which is usually weekly. So again, you can see that local news is continuing to decline because of the shutdown of these newspaper organizations. In fact, over 300 newspapers closed between 2018 and 2020. 6,000 journalists were no longer working in the industry. Print circulation declined by 5 million. We had a consolidation in ownership, meaning that fewer companies are owning the newspapers, and 80 local online newspaper websites were established, but simultaneously 80 stopped publishing. So we broke even in these years between 2018 and 2020. You can see in Alabama, and I've not traced the state lines very well. Forgive my geography here. I was just trying to give you an idea of where our state was in this county demographic. But you can see that we have 2 counties that have no newspaper at all, but a very large part of our state only has one newspaper. And so a lot of our areas are at risk for becoming news deserts. Now, another aspect of newspapers and access to news in local communities is paywalls. Paywalls are when a newspaper website requires a fee for access. It usually denotes higher quality journalism because that organization has more funding and thus more resources. And those paywalls become the subscriptions become a revenue for the newspaper. But if you don't pay that paywall, you can't have access to the news. The Wall Street Journal really pioneered this paywall service where they blocked access to their stories. And at one point, and maybe still in for many people, they considered this the financial savior of the newspaper industry because they said, oh, people will start paying for quality news, especially in an era of misinformation. We've seen that, there are many people who are willing to pay for news. But the question that you have to ask yourself in terms of social implications and overall fairness for democracy is, when should journalists restrict a paywall? When should they bring down that paywall to allow access for all? Uh, for the last presidential election, the Wall Street Journal decided to keep their paywall up on election day, and they saw a huge increase in subscriptions called the Trump bump. Because they didn't bring down their paywall. But many people said, shouldn't people have access to the news on election day and prior to be able to give them information that they need to vote? Well, I don't know. That's a question that's continuing to be debated. Uh, a lot of newspapers are also determining how much someone will pay to subscribe to a news website based on individual spending and reading habits that an algorithm determines. So, what I pay for the Wall Street Journal, or how many free stories I may be given as kind of a sample, may be different from what you are given. And so, is that really fair? And who gets to really determine that? Now, the Washington Post, after the naval base shooting in DC, decided to bring down their paywall because they said that they wanted everyone to be able to access that critical information. And so there have been times when organizations will bring down their paywalls. We've seen this a lot with COVID-19 coverage, in fact. So there are many people, especially at the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak in America, many news organizations decided to bring down their firewall for COVID-19 coverage. But, a lot of people were saying, well, that's a lot of lost revenue since there's an increased interest in news for COVID stories. These newspapers are really losing out on money that could help them get subscriptions and help them stay financially afloat to be able to report more on these stories in the future. So this is kind of a newer question for the journalism industry, but it's one that the industry and professionals really need to consider. You as a consumer also need to consider whether you would be willing to pay for news or not. You can get access to a lot better journalism through subscriptions, but there's a lot of information out there that's free. So it's something that you need to consider as well. Citizen journalism is also fairly recent with the advent of social media. However, it's really been used for a long time. If you think about it, I study school shootings within my research, and I always go back to that moment where the television stations were taking phone calls from students inside the school who had like cell phones on them, and they were calling the news stations. That ended up being very dangerous because what if the shooters were listening to the broadcast and could determine where the potential victims were hiding? So things like that, you really have to think about, especially in cases of disaster. But user-generated content is just that content that relies on the average person to provide content, whether that's visuals, whether that's information, to get more news. So James Spann actually does this on his Instagram. He tends to do it very successfully based on his Instagram following. He just posts people's pictures that they send him or tag him in on Instagram about weather. But there are some like more major stories, like this video that was broadcast on many different news stations after Kobe Bryant's death. This man was just videoing in his backyard and happened to catch the helicopter that Kobe Bryant and his daughter were in before they crashed. And he captured the final moments of that helicopter crash, and many news outlets actually showed it. So there are concerns about how journalists can verify information that is sent by a citizen journalist, whether it should be considered reliable enough for press. And then there are, of course, other concerns about ethics and how citizen journalists potentially obtain this information. Now, it is critical for us to also talk about the various minority presses that have been so critical to American journalism. The Black press is particularly impactful in American history, given that throughout time, they have been an important voice against slavery as well as civil rights, but unfortunately are dying off for many different reasons. So the first African-American newspaper was actually the Freedom's Journal from 1827 to 1829. It offered anti-slavery voice from an African-American perspective. It was often read in churches, in Black churches, for those who could not read themselves. And so many slaves were able to get this information where they wouldn't have been able to do that without this press. Frederick Douglass's North Star paper is perhaps one of the most widely known Black press examples. It was published in Rochester, New York from 1847 to 1860, and it had a circulation of over 3,000 people, which was very substantial for the time. Since 1827, there have been 5,500 Black edited and started papers, but the average lifespan of those papers is typically only 9 years. During civil rights and affirmative action, it was great that reporters were allowed into, the national and local newsrooms for the first time, but they remain predominantly white. And so these Black reporters are still very much the minority. You can see that in local daily papers, there are only 4.7% of newsroom staff who are Black. Now, today we see roughly 200 African American papers. Most of them are weeklies, but they still remain a strong voice for many of the racial topics that are important. So the Birmingham Times is one that is local, and they actually still continue to focus on African American community issues, and they are owned, and typically the employees are people of color. Now, the Spanish press or Hispanic press has also been very important to American culture. The largest Spanish daily is in Los Angeles, and it was founded all the way back in 1926, so this is certainly not anything new. The first one founded in the South was actually in 1808 in New Orleans. Miami Herald's El Nuevo Herald in 1976 became the first Spanish supplement, where the Miami Herald, which is an English-speaking newspaper, provided a Spanish language supplement, and they report the news in two languages. And it's very interesting when you do studies about how the stories are covered between the two. It's the same staff, it's the same organization, but a lot of times they get reported very differently, as you can see down here. Spanish television and radio has really taken the place of Spanish language newspapers. A lot of the readership, the audience, as well as the advertisers tend to prefer television and radio for Spanish speaking journalism. Asian American papers, there's very few in America. There are currently about 50 small U.S. papers that are printed in Vietnamese. There has been a large growth area, however, recently for Chinese publications. World Journal is the largest. A lot of Asian American papers focus on helping readers who are from foreign countries adjust to American life while trying to maintain their ties back to their Asian heritage. And so they can be an important bridging factor for Asian Americans. Asians only make up 3% of newsroom staffs, however, so they are very underrepresented in terms of employment within the journalism industry. Native American papers are also very important. The first was the Cherokee Phoenix in 1828 in Georgia. There are currently about 350 Native American papers, primarily published on reservations, mostly in English. They help educate tribes about their heritage and build solidarity. A lot of these Native American publications also cover gaming and its economic influence for the Native American tribes. Native Americans only make up 0.37% of newsroom staffs, however, so they are also underrepresented in the traditional newsroom. Underground press has been very important in terms of popular and social culture. They really question mainstream policies and values. They provide voice to radical opinions and others who would normally be excluded from the mainstream press. A lot of underground press don't have regular publication because a lot of underground press journalists are working part-time or volunteer. But one of the first and largest underground press publications is the Village Voice, which is in Greenwich Village. Started in the 50s, and these are typically distributed for free. They're funded by ads, but as a cultural issue becomes mainstream, as it becomes popular, a lot of these underground press operations are kind of taken from by the mainstream press to expand the mainstream cultural coverage, which some argue is good because it allows for a larger audience, while others argue that it kind of jeopardizes the true voice of that movement. So you can see how the Village Voice has affected our culture over time, in terms of the LGBTQ plus community, in terms of civil rights, even gender equality, and pop culture. So I want to leave us with this quote from John Maxwell Hamilton: "Journalism, like democracy, is not something that is achieved. It is a work in progress, and not every day is as good as the last." As studies continue to show that readers and other audiences are losing faith and trust in journalism, I think it's important for us as both consumers and potential media writers to understand that journalism is a work in progress, and we have the ability, through the ways that we write, through the ways that we consume news, to really shape it and continue to drive it towards something that will last and support a better democracy. So that is in your hands as media consumers and as potential media writers, and something that I take very seriously. I hope you will too. But newspapers are a wonderful place where democratic issues can come alive and really take shape and change the world. So I love journalism. It's always been a passion of mine.